morning, everyone. Welcome to the 9th plenary session by Dr. Francisco Rodriguez. He is the Rice Family Professor of Practice of International and Public Affairs at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's a Venezuelan economist with decades of experience in public service, academia, and the private sector. He has taught economics and public policy at the University of Maryland, Wesleyan University, and the University of Notre Dame. Rodriguez has held prominent positions in the public and private sector, including head of the Economic and Financial Advisory of the Venezuelan National Assembly, the head of the research team of the United Nations Human Development Report Office, and the chief Andean economist of the Bank of America. So welcome, Professor Rodriguez. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much, Fernando. And I'd like to thank you and thank Angel Alvarado and UPenn for this opportunity to talk about the political economy of Latin American development, and particularly to discuss more in detail the case of Venezuela in the framework of thinking about the interaction between commodity booms, reforms, and populism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There, you should be able to see it. As I said, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take Venezuela as a case study to help us think through some of these issues of how resource booms, populism, and reforms interact. And I want to start out by pointing out that studying the Venezuelan economy, as I do, is essentially the economics equivalent of being a rare disease specialist. It is the basket case. It is the worst performing country. And the problem with studying a country like this is that people will look at you and they will say, wow, yeah, fascinating, very interesting, but irrelevant. That country is just like too different. There's like this brand of Venezuelan exceptionalism that goes about that says, no, I mean, if it's the problem with Venezuela is that it had Chavez, and Chavez was unique, and perhaps then they'll also say, well, it has Maduro, who is also unique, and not sense a contradiction in the fact that there must be a pattern to that uniqueness. But it is a country that is to a certain extent it seems quite atypical. I mean, it's one of the few countries in Latin America who, when you hear their current leaders speak, I mean, it basically kind of looks like they're speaking with some hodgepodge of mix of material taken from 1960s communist pamphlets. So it's almost as if there was a country equivalent of the woman who woke up in that movie Goodbye Lenin, who didn't know that the Soviet Union and the Berlin Bloc had fallen, it would be Venezuela. However, Venezuela is very interesting, and I would argue, and have argued in my professional career, that it's very much worth looking at precisely because it is an anomaly. I mean, think of all the time that we spend thinking about growth miracles, all the time that we devote to South Korea, to Taiwan, to countries that have industrialized, which are actually also outliers. There are outliers on the positive side. Well, why shouldn't we be looking at outliers on the negative side? Why shouldn't we be looking at countries where growth collapses? Precisely understanding in the same way in which understanding miracles helps us understand what is necessary to drive growth. Understanding collapses also should help us understand what is it that can go wrong, and what are the type of institutions, arrangements, agreements that can exist in a society that can help sustain economic growth over time. And Venezuela is also, I think, very relevant to the region because it is a prime example of three phenomena that we talk a lot about and we worry a lot about when we worry about the region, and also when we worry about many other countries. So outside of the region. So economic populism. At one time, it was thought that this was purely a phenomenon of the developing countries. And what we've seen over recent years is that actually it's become very much of a concern in the United States, in Europe. The democratic backsliding, well, also definitely a concern in many Western societies. And Venezuela is also a prime example of democratic backsliding, of a country that was seen as the example of Latin American democracy, and now it's seen as one of the most extreme examples of authoritarianism in the region. And this did not happen in the traditional way. It didn't happen with a coup. It didn't happen because the military decided we're going to overthrow an elected government. It actually happened through elected governments. And it's also an example of a country that is very intensive in natural resources, that it has abundant reserves of oil, and whose exports are primarily, or I would say almost completely, exports of energy. So these are three phenomena which coincide in this very extreme example of growth, and it's worth asking then, how is it that these phenomena are connected? So let me show you a little bit about the Venezuelan growth experience. And what you see here is that this is a country that has had a terrible growth experience over the past 8 years, or well, the past decade, from 2012 to 2020. This is, and I'll show you some tables in a minute illustrating how this is one of the worst, and definitely the worst, economic collapse in Latin America, in Latin American economic history. But you also see something else here, which is that it's a poor growth experience. I mean, we can of course focus, and I will to a certain extent spend a lot of time discussing this collapse. But the reality is that this is a country that was doing quite poorly in terms of growth since the 1970s, since the late 1970s. And already by the end of the 90s, this was seen as one of the world's worst growth performers. In fact, Ricardo Hausman and I co-edited a book, which is actually edited by Penn State University Press, in which we refer to the Venezuelan experience as an economic collapse, and we subtitled it "Anatomy of an Economic Collapse." And some people, when they look at the book, they think that it's about Chavez, but no, it's actually about this period. It's about what went wrong here, or rather here. Chavez gets elected in 98. It was about the conditions that made Chavez possible. Chavez gets elected in 1998. Then you do have a very visible bump here, which is associated with an oil strike. But then you have a period of growth, and this growth is essentially driven by a terms of trade boom. And so we'll see it's actually a relatively poor growth performance given the magnitude of the terms of trade boom enjoyed by Venezuela during that time. And then we see this very, very atypical collapse. And I say that this collapse is atypical, the collapse that occurs after 2012, because it is, in fact, the sixth largest in world history since 1950. And if you look at all of the countries that are here, or most of the countries that are here, the collapses occur during periods of conflict, be it either interstate conflict or interstate conflict, that is civil wars. So it's relatively rare to appear in this list during peacetime. We really have basically 4 cases, and just 2 of them in the top 10, which are UAE and Venezuela. And UAE, by the way, is a very different case. And in fact, I have another paper where I take it out of this list using slightly different criteria for measuring collapses, because one of the problems, one of the things about UAE is that what really happened in UAE is that they opened up to low-skilled immigration. So they had a lot of immigration. That immigration, since it was a very rich country, it lowered their income per capita. Because it included the income per capita of low-skilled immigrants who were coming into the country, but it cannot be argued that it's a deterioration in the income of the people who were living there, or as big a deterioration in the income of the people who were living there. Whereas with Venezuela, you actually have the opposite process. You have a process of emigration, so that the conditions of the people who are who were originally living in the territory and continue to live in the territory has actually deteriorated dramatically. And this is a collapse of which is essentially the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. It's really very unusual when we focus just on Latin America. We can see that its magnitude is way out of sync. And with even with what are other basket cases, and this is also important in terms of one of the conventional explanations which is given of this collapse, which is the idea that this collapse was completely driven by policy, that it's just policy failures that drove this collapse. One of the problems is that while Venezuelan policies are and have been very poor during this period, they are not that different from that of some countries which also appear on this list. They're not that different from that of Nicaragua, which and by the way, in Nicaragua, this mixes 2 periods. It mixes the Sandinista revolution, and then it mixes the Somoza period, and mixes the Sandinista revolution. But the period of the Sandinista revolution is a period that is also associated with similar policies. And the collapse purely attributable, or that purely occurred during the Sandinista period, is somewhat lower. It's around 30%, similar to that of Peru during the Alan Garcia government, which also explains a large part of this decline. So we can find countries that had hyperinflations, that had huge misalignments of their exchange rates, that had price controls, that had nationalizations, that had all of these things going on, and their GDP collapses by much less than that of Venezuela. So in order to understand what has happened in this period, I think it's important to take a step back and think not only about what policymakers did wrong in terms of economic policy, but about the motivations for them doing it wrong. Because even if you have an explanation which says, okay, this is just bad policies, the bad policies led to the deterioration and to the collapse in growth, well, that's really almost like half an explanation, because it doesn't tell you why politicians carried out these bad policies. And remember that we're generally talking about politicians who are pretty savvy. They are politicians that are pretty able to play the political game that they play. So the explanation of saying, "Oh, it's just that they're ignorant, they didn't know what to do with the economy," it seems to me to be a very poor explanation, in the sense that we're talking about people who can take very good decisions in terms of their objectives. So the first thing that you want to ask is, what are their objectives? What are the objectives that the politicians are pursuing? And to understand why these objectives might be different from the objectives of maximizing income or of having the economy grow. And this was an insight that was brought into economics, I think, essentially with the public choice literature. Buchanan and Tullock famously argued that there was this huge difference between the way in which we understood markets, where we think of markets as being decentralized and being a lot of agents and actors taking optimizing decisions, and then we understand how what happens in society in those markets is derived from the individual maximizing actions of those agents. But up until the 1960s, a lot of economics, or I would say all of economics, and still a lot of economics, basically ask these questions of, well, what policies are good, what policies are bad, what is the effect of policies, without asking the deeper question of how is it that these policies come about as a result of maximization by political actors. Why? So we seem to treat, or at least standard economics used to treat before the public choice literature, the decisions of politicians as somewhat being different than the decisions of economic actors. So one side is trying to understand why, of answering this puzzle, is trying to understand why politicians can pursue inefficient policies in order to attain their political objectives. And another literature that I want to bring in, which helps us also shed light on why and when these periods of democratic backsliding can coincide with deterioration of economic policy, is the literature on democratization that emphasizes the role of stakes of power. And stakes of power are essentially the inequality in the rewards from power to political actors. So the higher the stakes of power, the better that it is to be in office, and the worse that it is to be out of office. In the end, I mean, at the extreme, you can think of a dictatorship or the most authoritarian types of dictatorships as being cases in which those who have power can essentially destroy or kill or send into exile those who lose the contest for power. So that is very high stakes of power. Very low stakes of power, you can think about the arrangements, say, for national unity governments, arrangements like, or arrangements for limiting political competition, such as the one that Colombia had during many years, where there was an agreed alternation in power of the two main political parties. So there is a literature that comes back to the work of Adam Jaworski and his seminal book, Democracy in the Market in 1991, that emphasizes that the higher that the stakes of power are, the greater the risks that political actors are going to take in their fight for power. And what I want to emphasize here is that adopting policies that create economic distortions is one of the ways to take that risk. So that these two literatures, if you combine them, we can start to get an explanation for why these growth collapses occur. And they occur, and they are, in my explanation, largely driven by increases in the stakes of power that make politicians not only more willing to take political risk, but also to take risks with the economy. And in this sense, I think that it's very important to try to understand that political conflict is, in that sense, not all that different from military armed conflict. By the way, that's a cue that we should get just from observing the Venezuelan statistics. And when we see that that it's one of the few countries that gets into that list without being in a war, we have to ask ourselves, well, is it possible that the country is actually undergoing a war, except that in this war, not necessarily cannons are being fired, but other things are being done that can create as much harm. Karl von Clausewitz famously in 1832 said that war can never be separated from political intercourse, and began this tradition of thinking of war and politics along the same lines. And I also want to invoke a type of military tactic which, even though it's very old, a lot of times is associated with General W.T. Sherman, Union General, who in his invasion of the South followed what's known as a scorched earth strategy. And the scorched earth strategy is a strategy of destruction. And it's a strategy which says, if you're fighting against your enemy and you're thinking of ways to defeat your enemy, one way is that you try to kill your enemy directly. Another way is that you try to undermine your enemy's capacity to survive by undermining his economic means. And that's exactly what he said in a telegram to Ulysses Grant in 1862, where he wrote, "Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it, but the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources." So if generals do this in war, why don't politicians do it also? Or when do politicians do it? In the US, we're actually facing up to a very interesting debate right now, which has to do with whether the debt ceiling is going to be extended. And as you may know, there's 7 weeks left, essentially, until the U.S. will be unable to pay its debt and will be forced to default on its debt unless a deal is reached with the Republican-controlled Congress so as to extend this debt ceiling. Now, this has happened 9 times in the past. Always a deal has been reached. 2011 was the moment where it got most extreme, where it went down to the last minute. And in fact, it spooked markets enough that S&P lowered the credit rating of the U.S. Right now, there's a lot of speculation about what might happen, and if in effect there will be a deal or there won't. But the reality is that politicians in many settings face this type of choices all the time. Do we strike a deal and do we kind of resolve our differences, or do we decide that we are not going to strike a deal? And if we don't strike a deal, that failure to strike a deal may have very significant negative economic consequences. So in other words, what we really have to understand is when is it that politicians are willing to harm their economy, and when is it also that democracy becomes less enforceable? And the reason that these two phenomena are related is that the characteristic of democracy and what makes democracy somewhat peculiar as an institution is that it has to be self-enforcing. So there's nobody else. I mean, at the very root of democracy, as Adam Jaworski said in his work, and I think as even more strikingly, Mario Vargas Llosa, when he referred to the Mexican PRI as the perfect dictatorship, he was 2 years before Jaworski wrote. Actually, he was basically putting in words the idea that democracy is really about alternation in power, and that democracy occurs, that we know that a democracy occurs when not because elections are held, but when those who lose office are actually willing to give up office. But that requires something quite peculiar. It requires taking those who have the monopoly of power to decide to give up that power voluntarily just because they've lost an election. I mean, Thomas Hobbes thought that this was impossible, right? That's why he said, look, the only way that you solve this problem is that you actually give power to a sovereign, and that sovereign's power has to be absolute. We've seen countries solve this, but they solve it because incentives are created so that politicians will abide by self-imposed limits on their actions, which is the same thing that happens when politicians say, we're not going to let the US default. Politicians are essentially saying there are limits on our strategies, and those limits are limits that we're not willing to cross those red lines. And Mitch McConnell, the Republican majority leader in the 2011 discussions on the debt ceiling, said that, referring to the internal discussion among the Republican Party, said, some of us thought that that was a hostage worth shooting, that is, forcing the U.S. into default, but the majority of us thought that was not the case. Now, political actors can decide to adopt these strategies, which are strategies that I call scorched earth strategies. They're strategies that generate severe negative economic externalities in their fight for power. And this is much more likely to occur when the stakes of power are high. So in this sense, it's important to return and to understand some of the reforms that were done in Venezuela in the 1990s, and particularly towards the end of the 1990s, with the 1999 Constitution, that significantly increased the power of the executive branch. We saw, by the way, similar reforms along those times in Bolivia and Ecuador, and not surprisingly, Bolivia and Ecuador are also countries that are starting to show the signs of this very polarized conflict, because those reforms essentially took away the protection of political minorities. And by political minorities, I mean those who lose elections. So in these situations, you can have conditions when power is effectively contested. That is, when there could be a leader that is authoritarian, but there is a threat on his power. Because if the leader has complete absolute power, then they actually don't have an incentive to carry out inefficient policies, or at least not the type of incentive that I'm characterizing. It's their fear of losing power that leads them to opt for what I call scorched-earth strategies, which are political strategies that generate severe negative economic externalities, but that nevertheless are politically optimal. And what's important to understand here is that this can be an equilibrium in which both sides that are fighting for power actually have an incentive to adopt these scorched-earth strategies. And it's a prisoner's dilemma, and they do it because the other side does it, or at least the reason why, or let me not get into necessarily into their psychology. The reason why it is optimal for them to do it is because the other side is doing it. Now, how is this connected with extractive rents? Well, first of all, it's connected because natural resources can raise the stakes of power. So when a country becomes richer, when it has a positive, when the state, for example, owns the oil industry, and you have a large positive terms of trade boom, then that means that the central government becomes more powerful. It has more money, among other things, to buy off politicians. So therefore, being in power is a lot better when you have a positive resource boom, or when you nationalize an oil industry, than being outside of power. So that's why it's not surprising that you find a lot of authoritarian regimes in natural resource extractive countries, because the dynamics of power implies that it's much more difficult to sustain a democracy when being in power gives you access to all of those natural resource rents. The other thing that happens is that politicians, particularly when their power is under threat, are much more likely to prioritize short-term results. So we start looking at these politicians and we say, oh, these politicians are doing things that look stupid. I mean, that they're not the things that economics textbooks tells us that they should be doing. And we believe that it's just because they have a wrong theories of the world. But there's actually a very clear political logic for this, which is that they are prioritizing the short term, they're prioritizing the near term, because the cost for them of losing power is too high. And in fact, we can see several instances in which, for example, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country that under Mugabe had done relatively moderate land reforms for a period of 20 years. And then it shifted to a very aggressive land reform, which completely destroyed property rights just after Mugabe lost the referendum and almost lost control of Congress. So it's the contestation of power that makes for these politicians in these settings of high stakes of power concentrate in short term. And therefore, that's why in this type of societies with high stakes of power, we're much more likely to see economically destructive political conflict emerge. So how do we apply this to Venezuela? So first of all, yes, Venezuela is a basket case. However, if you look at this more with a longer run perspective, we'll also find that Venezuela is a country that had very high growth rates during the 1920 to 1970 period, the highest in Latin America. It became the richest country in Latin America. It also became a democratic country, and in fact, the longest lived democracy in South America. So you had a period during which oil rents were actually pretty successful. But around the time of the 1970s, when you have the first oil boom, this oil boom leads to power infighting among elites in Venezuela, and that's the moment where you see the GDP peaking. So yes, you had oil at $2. That oil generated rents, which was able to sustain economic growth. When oil went to $12 in the 1970s, then the balance of power shifted, and you had too powerful a government, and this made politics a lot more nasty. Then when oil went to $30 briefly at the beginning of the 80s, then politics got even nastier. So during this period, you have huge levels of capital flight. And capital flights are very interesting from the standpoint of this phenomenon because the capital flight that occurred in Venezuela occurred basically as a result of overvalued exchange rates. So you had this dynamics in which whoever was in power, regardless of which party was in power, they maintained an overvalued exchange rate. And Venezuela accumulated among the highest levels in Latin America of private sector foreign asset holdings, so that when the country was undergoing a debt crisis, both, by the way, in the 1980s and today, the amount of foreign assets held by its nationals was more than double the amount of the country's foreign debt. So in other words, the real reason that these countries had a debt crisis is that the central bank basically sold all the dollars in its international reserves to the private sector. So why was the central bank doing that? Well, if you talk to policymakers at the time, they tell you we could not devalue. We could not devalue because we had a political imperative. If we did that, we were going to lose the election, and the cost of losing the election was too high. And when you look at the more contemporary period during the Maduro regime, you also find one of the most misaligned exchange rates precisely during the periods during which his power was most contested. That's why it's not a coincidence that Venezuela goes into hyperinflation 2 years, or actually 1 year, essentially, after the opposition gains control of the National Assembly. But it's not because the opposition did something to cause the hyperinflation. It's because the political contestation made Maduro believe that he had to maintain a fixed exchange rate and an overvalued exchange rate. And this was used by economic groups in order to carry out that capital flight. Now, you have then the period of the 1990s where you have a collapse in oil prices, you have a collapse in the banking sector, and you have reforms that completely stall. And this period of low growth is what makes it easier for Chavez to win the election. And Chavez benefits from a huge oil boom. I mean, Chavez, when he was elected, on the week that he won the elections, Venezuelan oil was trading for $8 a barrel. This was a historical low in terms of real prices. When Chavez died, Venezuelan oil was trading at more than $100 a barrel. In that period, you do have political reforms, and you have the 1999 Constitution, which significantly increases the stakes of power. But nevertheless, those conditions, those favorable economic conditions, made it possible to maintain political conflict within certain limits. After 2013, when Chavez dies and Maduro is elected in a disputed election, but he wins it by a very small margin, you also get oil prices starting to decline. So the situation of Maduro in that sense is a lot more difficult than that of Chavez, because Chavez could carry out populist policies, but Chavez could satisfy both the electorate, voters, with higher oil revenues, and the selectorate, which are the ones who really determine whether you're in power, like the military. When oil prices start declining for Maduro, he really has to choose between the electorate and the selectorate, and he chose the selectorate clearly, and that's what leads to Venezuelan democratic backsliding. So, I mean, short history: you still have significant levels of political competition and contestation of power, so much so that the opposition can win a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly. Starting in 2018, as a result and in response to a democratic backsliding, the opposition decides to boycott a presidential vote, and it generates this other kind of new attempt to contest Maduro's power, which is what leads to and is associated with the imposition of very strong economic sanctions, which we'll talk about in a minute. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the terms of trade shock, the percentage change in Venezuela in terms of trade between 1998 and 2012 was 800%. countries that did well during this period in Latin America had a doubling of their terms of trade, a ninefold increase in your terms of trade, which is what Venezuela has, was something that no other country in the region even dreamed of. So in this sense, the economic performance during Chavez is actually quite poor. And when you look at one way to decompose this is by looking at the productivity statistics. And when we do it, we get a decline in productivity of about 3%, both during the Chavez and the Maduro years. So productivity was actually falling at relatively similar rates. What was masking the decline in productivity during the Chavez years was high oil revenues. What made the decline in productivity evident during the Maduro years was declining oil revenues. So during that period, one thing that we can see, and it's remarkable, is that in a period of high oil prices, you would have expected oil production to rise, and you didn't get that in Venezuela. You actually got somewhat of a decline. There were some periods of stability, and I'll talk more about these periods later on. Really the measure that you should stack it against is that of other countries that were increasing their oil production. And here you see what happened to OPEC. So even before we get into this recent period, which is the period of sanctions, and we'll talk more about this, even before that, you see that OPEC production is increasing slowly, and Venezuela production is declining. So Venezuela is losing ground when other countries were increasing oil production. So let's talk more about these populist policies and the incentives for them. And I want to give you a couple of examples from the side of Maduro. One of them is something that in Venezuela we call the Dacazo. We called it Dacazo because there was a very important electronics retailer, the Venezuelan equivalent of Best Buy, that in 2013, Maduro decided that he was going to go on national TV and accused them of price gouging, accused them of inflating the prices of their products. Now, what I want to highlight is the timing of this. Maduro did this exactly 1 month before municipal elections, which were his first elections in office. So Maduro had won the 2013 presidential election, which some people claim that he didn't win, but in any case, I mean, there was some contestation as to that, but it was by a very slim margin. But in the municipal elections, December 2013 municipal elections, was going to be his first test while he was in power. And the economy was not doing well already in 2013 because Chavez had financed this huge pre-election boom. So the economy had started to slow as they hit the brakes from that. And his approval ratings had started going down, those of Maduro. So most polls at that time told you that the government was likely to lose the municipal elections. And the opposition started presenting these municipal elections as a referendum on Maduro. The Maduro decides that he has to do something. And what he does is that he gets on TV and he says, hey, these guys are charging absurdly high prices. And you know what? They're charging these prices in which they're marking up these electronics products to the black market dollar prices, even though we are giving them dollars at the preferential exchange rate of 4.3 bolivars per dollar. And they're selling them as if we were giving them dollars at 100 bolivars per dollar. So they're essentially abusing, they're stealing from the state and from you, is what Maduro said on national TV. Well, when he says that, what that essentially generates is a looting of DACA. So after people heard him, they felt that they had to go and get their hands on these products that were, according to the president, being stolen from them. Maduro finally calls in the National Guard. But he calls in the National Guard not to stop the looting, but to organize it. So basically, when the National Guard comes in, he forces DACA to lower all of their prices and to sell them at prices which were essentially 1/10 or 1/20th of the market prices. Now, what I want to highlight is that this is terrible economic policy. This is the worst economic policy that you can imagine. And this is an economic policy that had very profound consequences in terms of scarcity in coming years in Venezuela. But this is a policy that got Maduro a 10-point boost in the polls and allowed him to win that crucial election. So this is one example of how high stakes of power, very contested power, when you have, be it an election or be it another event that the government sees as an existential threat, this is going to force them to adopt very short-term incentives. And this is also one way of understanding hyperinflation. So why did Venezuela go through a hyperinflation? Why are Venezuela and Zimbabwe the only two countries that have gone through hyperinflations in the 21st century? Well, if you think about hyperinflation just as governments are stupid and they print money, then that's not much of an explanation. I mean, it's a very simple explanation. If you think of a hyperinflation as being a way in which you can generate higher levels of spending in the short term with long-term consequences, then they make a lot of sense politically as political strategies, both in the Venezuelan and the Zimbabwean setting, because of the high stakes of power and the contestation of power. Another element, now, obviously, evaluating that politicians are distorting policies is actually not that easy, and there are serious identification problems. So in some of my recent research, I've been trying to look at natural experiments. And one example is that of a very recent election that occurred in 2022 in the state of Barinas. Now, there's a bit of a background to this election, is that in 2021 elections, the government won 19 out of 23 governorships, but they got this big surprise because they lost the state of Barinas. And why is the state of Barinas important? Because it's Chavez's home state. And it was Chavez's brother who was actually a candidate for re-election there. So this was a huge embarrassment, losing the state of Barinas. And they also lost it before a candidate from, I'd say, one of the more hardline sectors of the Venezuelan opposition. So the Supreme Court ordered that this election be repeated. It was also a very, very close election. So what I do in this paper is that we collected data on the food boxes that were being given out under the government's food box program in Barinas, and we compared them with those of a neighboring state, Apure, which had elections in the first round in November, and when they were regularly scheduled in November 21st of 2021, but of course didn't have repeat elections. The only country that had the repeat elections was, the only state that had the repeat elections was Barinas. So Apure serves as a control group, and we can use a special election as a natural experiment to see the extent to which the government is using the food boxes politically. And what we find is that effectively, as you see, and those of you who've studied a bit of the statistics, the pre-intervention trends, there's no systematic difference. They're pretty much growing at the same level. After you start the campaign for the special elections, then you do get a huge increase in the number of food boxes that's given out in Barinas, and you get a flattening of those of Apure. So that effectively what we call the treatment effect here is akin to a doubling of the food boxes received by a standard family in Barinas, the treatment group, as opposed to Apure, the control group. And this is the type of quasi-experimental, natural experiment evidence that allows you to understand the extent to which the government is using social programs for political means. Because if you just see a correlation between Chavismo and the number of food boxes, that can have many explanations. It can be because Chavista supporters tend to be poorer, for example, or they may be families that are more in need, or it may be because they self-select into the program because the opposition supporters don't want to receive boxes from the program because they hate the government. The natural experiment can help you identify this and effectively pinpoint that it is a government decision to target the food boxes politically. And it's another way in which electoral incentives or incentives of short-run survival distort economic and social policies in this setting. Now, all of this said, when you look at Venezuela's economic collapse, there's a very important driver of it, which is the decline in oil exports. So while these policies were such as the decaso and such as the targeting of the food boxes, while these policies were leading to lower productivity, the main driver of Venezuela's decline is the decline in oil exports. There's been, between 2012 and 2020, oil exports in the country declined by 93%. And in this graph, what you can see is that this decline in oil exports, well, remember, oil exports is price times quantities. This decline in oil exports really has two components. One of them is the variation in prices, and the other one is the variation in quantities, which we'll see more clearly in the next slide. But what I want to point out here is that if you look at the first part of this, which is 2012 to 2016, then what you see is a decline that is basically driven by lower oil prices. But from 2016 on, oil prices start recovering. Then they take this hit during COVID, but in general, they start recovering from their lows in 2016. But oil exports are not really recovering that much, and they continue declining. Why? Because oil production is declining. This graph is really important in assessing explanations of the Venezuelan crisis, because some people will just tell you, some people will, for example, just show you a graph of imports and say, oh, imports started declining in 2012, and you had seen a huge decline in imports before sanctions were imposed in 2017. Therefore, sanctions don't have an effect on the import decline. And that's really very sloppy thinking for several reasons. But the main one is that we know what happened between 2012 and 2016. The country had a huge negative oil shock. Its oil prices declined by 70%. So if the price that, and oil is 95% of Venezuelan exports, so it's not surprising that if you had this huge decline, the country would go into crisis. By the way, it went into crisis because it had this decline and was not prepared to deal with it because of Chavez's very bad handling of the positive oil boom. But what you get from 2017 on is a bit of a different animal. And here, and I'm going to go forward a bit. Here you see it much more clearly. So remember, I had shown you Venezuelan oil production, the more longer term. Now I'm just focusing on the period since 2008. And you see that oil production actually was pretty stable between 2008 and 2015. And this is mostly because the government actually reaches an agreement with foreign oil partners that allows them to stay in Venezuela, giving them a lot more control over oil cash flow. In 2016, oil production starts declining, but this happens, this actually happened in a lot of countries at the time, and it happened in high-cost producers. It didn't happen in all of them. It didn't happen in Saudi Arabia, which can produce very cheaply. But if you're a high-cost producer and you were selling something for $100 and now you're selling it for less than $30, then it makes sense for you to cut back production. But in those other producers, what we see is oil production stabilizing. In Venezuela, we see oil production declining. First, after financial or debt sanctions are imposed, then after primary oil sanctions are imposed in January 2019, then after secondary oil sanctions are imposed in February of 2020. And what I want to then, I want to go back to this slide, which I could have also titled, it takes two to tango. I mean, for you to have economically destructive political conflict, you have to have, there are incentives for both political actors to say, we're going to pursue strategies that may have negative economic externalities, but that make sense from a political standpoint in terms of our fighting for power. And in fact, what we definitely see is that after in 2016, the opposition is trying to pursue a recall referendum, and government-controlled courts invalidate this recall referendum. We see opposition strategy changing. And at the beginning of 2017, the opposition in Venezuela takes an explicit decision to boycott lending to the Maduro government, which it had not done in 2016. So early 2017, the president of the National Assembly starts sending letters to banks like Deutsche Bank, telling them you shouldn't finance a dictatorship. There's a campaign against Goldman Sachs for a financing operation that ended up being labeled the hunger bonds. There were protests by Venezuelan activists at Goldman Sachs headquarters. And there was a very strong lobbying effort, but it was very much directed at stopping the government from having access to dollars. And it began with financing. It began with its access to financing. And then it followed on in 2019 after the disputed 2018 election, which the opposition, most of the opposition boycotted with the imposition of the oil sanctions in 2019. And then the secondary sanctions on non-US companies dealing with Venezuela. And as you saw in this graph, all of these were associated with inflection points. Now, obviously, making inferences out of a time series is somewhat difficult. Whenever you see a kink in a time series, you're tempted to attribute it to something that happened at that time, and somebody else will come out and say, but there were 1,000 other things happening at that time. Now, if you see kind of 3 different episodes, it's a bit more convincing. I mean, this is kind of like having somebody suffer through 3 different episodes of anaphylactic shock after 3 different incidents of eating lobster. The first time, if it had been just one incident, you could have said, oh, well, maybe they were tired, maybe it was something in their drink, something in the tequila, or or any other reasons. They had a fight with their families, any other reasons. If it happens 3 times, then it's a bit harder to deny that this person has a seafood allergy. But nevertheless, it can still be the case that you can dispute any of these 3, and perhaps the 3 interventions. So part of some of my more recent work, and this is a paper that just came out last year in the Latin American Economic Review, is it tries to use firm level data to look at this issue, and it tries to essentially investigate the channel of causation of financial sanctions. So what we do here is that we compare between firms in Venezuela, even though the oil sector is nationalized and it belongs to the national oil company, there are joint ventures with foreign companies. And in those joint ventures, as I mentioned earlier, some very special conditions have been negotiated for many of them. And some of these conditions made the firms able to have access to financing. And that financing essentially happened through the joint venture partner lending to the Venezuela government-controlled joint venture. So we can distinguish between the firms that had financing access prior to the 2017 sanctions and the firms that had no financing access prior to the 2017 sanctions. And what we see is that those that did have financing were growing, production was growing prior. Those that had no financing, production was declining. After you bar financing for all of them, then they start declining at the same rate. This is essentially a difference in differences analysis, but it's a little bit turned on its head in the sense that we're thinking about this period as being the treatment period in which the firms that some firms were given access to financing, some of them were not. After the sanctions, then these firms are completely equal, or they should be equal, and the data confirms that. The data effectively identifies basically identical rates of decline among these different sets of firms after you closed off the access to finance of one of them. So all of this kind of reaffirms thesis that what you really have happening in Venezuela at this moment was an example of economically destructive political conflict, where essentially both sides found that it made sense as part of their political strategy to adopt strategies that had severe negative economic externalities. And by the way, and I want to make this clear, this this explanation is a positive explanation of Venezuela's economic collapse. It's in no moment intended to assign responsibility, moral or ethical responsibility. I don't think that that's the labor of positive economics, and I don't think that that's something that we economists are really very good at. So you can make a very coherent argument that even if it's true that the opposition decided that it wanted to block financing and access to funds to the Maduro government, and that had economic consequences, that was morally right because of the way in which Maduro had undermined democratic institutions. Instead of getting into that discussion, I would invite you to think of this as if you were studying the prisoner's dilemma. So when you're studying the prisoner's dilemma, what you want to understand is the incentives of the two prisoners to reach a deal with the district attorney that will imply their accusing the other prisoner. That deal is suboptimal for the prisoners relative to cooperation. If they could both commit to not accusing each other, then they would both walk. We know that. And if we were trying to say explain the prisoner's dilemma, I mean, imagine that you're studying the prisoner's dilemma in prisons, and you find that it's a very good theory, and then you come across the family or the families of the prisoners' families, and you find that what they want to talk about is which of the prisoners is guilty for having reached a deal with the DA to accuse the other one first. Now, I can see why that's a very important discussion for the families of the prisoners. It can be what's most important. I mean, if they can say, look, it wasn't my husband who ratted on you, it was your husband who ratted on mine. That for that person who's making the argument can sound as the most important discussion. But there's an underlying discussion which they should be having, which is, well, why is it? So what are the incentives that made it inevitable for both of them to end up engaging in this conduct, which was suboptimal for them? Well, that's the way in which I would invite you to think about economically destructive political conflict. And I think that a reason why that thinking is useful is because it also allows us to focus on the necessary institutional reforms that might be needed, such as, for example, constitutional reforms that lower the stakes of power in order to make it less likely that politicians end up falling in this equilibrium of damaging the economy as a byproduct of their conflicts for power. So to summarize, the basic point that I'm trying to make is that Venezuela is an example of a massive economic collapse, that we should use economic collapses to help us understand progress just in the way that we look at economic miracles, that the explanations that highlight poor policies are best incomplete because they don't tell you why politicians carry out those poor policies, and that when we start looking at these growth implosions, we can identify shifting political incentives. And that gives us a fuller explanation, which can also help us think about what are the needed institutional reforms and what is the role that low stakes of power play in sustaining democracy and economic progress. So when you see, for example, discussions in countries like the US where people say, oh, we have a conservative Supreme Court, we should just pack the court and appoint new justices. I'm not saying that that's a good idea or that that's a bad idea. I'm just saying that when you think about things like court packing, there should be a huge sign of handle with care and use only in cases of very, very extreme emergency, because when you start raising the stakes of power by doing things like packing the court, which Chavez did in 2003, you can actually be undermining the key institutions that are necessary, not just for sustaining democracy, but also for enabling economic progress and avoiding economic collapses. Okay, well, thank you. And I'd love to take your questions now.
Thank you, Professor Rodriguez. Let's start with the broadest question about, it says, the political economy story was quite interesting. But what's special, what's unique about Venezuela? A lot of countries actually have overspent and they experience high commodity prices, they mess with exchange rates, they have a lot of political conflict, they print too much money. But as you previously said, that they do not have the same scale of collapse as Venezuela. So it's just that Venezuela had the worst, or what?
Yeah, so I think that there are, yes, I mean, I agree that that's a key question. And that question is to a certain extent what drives this explanation and what drives me for going kind of beyond just the poor policies explanation. And what I would say is that economically destructive, so the story that I'm telling is one where what drives a large part of the collapse, and let me be clear, there are policy choices which are similar to those of other countries, as I said, Peru and Nicaragua, as examples, and many of those have to do with the collapse. And even if you think about, say, the reaction of the economy to the initial decline in oil prices between 2012 and 2016. Venezuela is a country that has as much oil as under the ground as Saudi Arabia. It produces a third, and it saved basically none of it during this huge oil boom. If it had saved a reasonable quantity, if Venezuela had, for example, maintained its macroeconomic stabilization funds law, which was in the books in 1999 and the government complied with up until 2002, then it would have had $150 billion in international reserves when oil prices started declining. So that initial contraction would have been much lower. So definitely there are some explanations in which part of the collapse is similar to those of other countries. Now, what is peculiar or unique about Venezuela, I would argue, is the combination of the very high stakes of power that occurred in the as a result of the reforms of the 1990s. And if you look at some of the very careful work that's been done, for example, by Javier Corrales, he finds that the post-1999 constitution is essentially in Latin America, the Venezuelan constitution is the one that gives most power to the executive branch. So in terms of the parameters of the model, if stakes of power is an important parameter, that parameter was basically taken to the maximum in Venezuela. Something else that I going to describe more fully in my models is that there's an interaction between the stakes of power and a country's endowments, and you have to think of its endowments essentially as its revenues, as its oil revenues. At least in the case of Venezuela, so that if its oil revenues are high, then you can sustain higher stakes of power, and therefore you don't fall into economically destructive political conflict, even though the stakes of power are high. Because when the stakes of power are high, governments can satisfy both the electorate and the selectorate, and they will prefer to satisfy the electorate. If they can stay in power by satisfying the electorate, they will do it. You have the descent into economically destructive political conflict at the moment at which it's no longer feasible for the government to satisfy both the electorate and the selectorate. And that can be driven by negative terms of trade shocks. So that's why when you look at Venezuela, you have to think about this in terms of two timings. One of them is 1999. And by the way, it's not just 1999, it's the late 90s, because there were also reforms that were done in the late 90s, which came, which were aimed at weakening political parties. And the whole idea was that political parties were thought to be too strong, and that was thought to be a problem with Venezuela. So people talked a lot about the partidocracia, the partyocracy. So what you ended up happening as a result of the reforms in the 90s is that you ended up with very high stakes of power, with a very powerful central government, with a very weak opposition, whoever was in the opposition. You ended up, for example, abolishing public financing of political parties, which of course benefits the government very much so, because the government is always going to have the access to public resources in order to finance its campaigns. But what really drove the economy into a tailspin was the negative terms of trade shock that occurred in the 2012-16 period, and particularly 2014 to 16, which was what left the government without the means to satisfy both the electorate and this electorate, and it ended up leading to that shift of strategies. And that's why Maduro is the one who does it acaso. That's why it's not Chavez, because when oil revenues were high, Chavez was able to say to DACA, okay, how many dollars do you need in order to maintain those low prices? And he was able to say to the central bank, you sell all of the dollars necessary so that we keep the black market rate down enough so that the distortions and the incentives for retailers to raise their prices is going to be much less. It's when Maduro runs out of that money, and this begins in 2013 because Chavez had overspent in order to get reelected in 2012. So when Maduro runs out of that money, that he has to start appealing to other tactics like the Tacazo, which are tactics that destroy economic incentives but are powerful for him. So I would argue that it's rare to find cases of both such high stakes of power as in Venezuela and such volatility in the terms of trade. Because if you look at Ecuador, if you look at Colombia, if you look at Mexico, these are countries where oil can account for 50% or less of exports. If you look at Venezuela, oil accounts for 95% of exports. So that volatility in the terms of trade combined with high stakes of power is what can lead you to a situation where the government says, I can't respond to the electorate anymore. I can't satisfy the electorate. I'm going to shift my political strategies. And then all political actors shift to those political strategies because it's what's optimal for them to do.
Great. More particular question on the case of Venezuela asks, beyond the exhaustion of the rent-seeking capitalism model and obviating its obvious effects regarding opacity, corruption in the institutions, what consequences did the elimination of the Economic Advisory Office of the National Assembly have on the Venezuelan economy?
What consequences did the what? Sorry?
The elimination of the Economic Advisory Office of the National Assembly.
Okay, well, that's very it's a question, of course, that's very, very close to heart. As you mentioned in the introduction, I headed the Economic and Financial Advisory Office of the National Assembly between 2000 and 2004. That office had been recently created. It was created in 1997. So I was basically its second director, appointed by at least its second appointed director. The office had it was set up as part of reforms that were negotiated with support of the Inter-American Development Bank, and as part of the conditions for the setting up of the office, the IADB demanded that the office be given full autonomy. And in fact, that was the reason why I accepted the position. And that full autonomy was not only operational, but the firing of both the hiring and the firing of the head of the office was with a 2/3 majority. The government did not have, when the 2000 Congress National Assembly got installed, the Chavez party did not have a 2/3 majority, which is why they had to negotiate with the opposition the appointment, which is what led to my appointment. What we did while we were in the office is that first of all, we made it and we established the systematic writing of reports that would assess the budget impact of proposed legislation. And those reports were actually a necessary condition for the law to be approved in first discussion. What that meant is that Congress would actually get an evaluation of the cost of any law project. And I mean, I can tell you a lot of stories about that time, but I'll tell you just one, which is that at one moment I got called up by the head of the Social Development Commission, and this was somebody from the Socialist Party, from the, well, at that moment it wasn't Socialist, it was the Movimiento Quinta República, Chavez's party. And they were, they had a law project, which was reforming the Social Security laws, which basically our conclusion was, look, if you guys do this, then you're not going to be able to pay reasonable pensions to anybody in Venezuela 10 years from now. I mean, the demographic changes are so clear that this is completely unsustainable. The president of the commission called me to his office. He said that I had to change the report, that I had to eliminate all of that section on the sustainability of the Social Security system. And I said, no, I mean, I can't do it. That would be a violation of my prerogatives. If you believe that I'm doing my work wrong, you should take that to the National Assembly. They should consider firing me, but I'm not going to change the technical assessment. And in fact, that legislator did try to get me fired, but wasn't able to get the 2/3 majority until several years later, he finally convinced them to change the rules so that I could be fired by a simple majority. So I was fired by the simple majority of the government in 2004. The name of that legislator, by the way, is Nicolas Maduro. He was the president of the Social Development Commission at that moment. Yes, and after they fired me, they basically closed the office down. And the office also played a very important role in terms of accountability, because as part of the monitoring that we did of the economy, we had to do things such as assess compliance with the macroeconomic stabilization law fund, and one of our reports, which caused a lot of anger among the Chavez government at us and at myself personally, was when we identified that the government had not deposited the funds that it was mandated to deposit by law into the macroeconomic stabilization fund. So basically, when the government in 2001 started raiding the macroeconomic stabilization fund, now that's the type of assessments that can only be done by an independent institution. And that's why it was actually so important for the government to eliminate that institution, to eliminate any vestiges of institutional independence, be it in our case, be it in the case of the central bank, or be it in other parts of the Venezuelan state. So that story, which to me is deeply personal, is also part of the story of that I'm trying to tell more broadly, of the deterioration of Venezuelan institutions and of the increase in the stakes of power, which ultimately is at the root, in my view, of the country's economic collapse.
Well, great. We have run out of time, so we thank you, Professor Rodriguez, for your talk and answering the questions. And we remind everyone that we will have our final week next week. We will have Felipe Valencia kind of wrapping up the semester with a summary of long-term development of Latin America, and then we will conclude with a plenary talk by Jim Robinson. And well, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.